Okay, so I think it's good we start with Surah Al-Fatiha. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين صدق الله العلي العظيم. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين ولعن الله ولا أعدائهم أجمعين من الأولين والآخرين آمين يا رب العالمين أما بعد. Peace be upon you, O son of the messenger of God. Peace be upon you, O son of the master of the successors. We bear witness that you are the trustee of God and the son of his trustee. You lived a blessed life, departed praiseworthy, and died a martyr, deprived and wronged. And we bear witness that God will fulfill what he promised you, and will destroy those who abandoned you, and punish those who killed you. And we bear witness that you fulfilled the covenant of God, and strove in his way until certainty came to you. So may God's mercy be away from those who killed you and wronged you, and may God's mercy be away from the people that heard of this and were pleased with it. O God, we make you our witness that we are friends to those who befriend you and enemies to those who are hostile toward you. May our fathers and our mothers be sacrificed for you, O son of the messenger of God. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Please give me a salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد
وآل
وآل
محمد
محمد.
وعجل.
So this is the 15th in our series of sessions for these nights of Ashura and now continuing in these blessed nights of Arbaeen on the subject of Tabyeen or clarification. This is the fifth and final part of the second series on Tabyeen. As with all of our other series and sessions, such as those on patience, the lantern of the path, or the art of supplication, it is very strongly recommended that anyone consuming this, at the very least, review the previous sessions prior to consuming this one. This is because of the nature of the discussion, the style of discourse really does require that each part build upon the ones that came before. This is to make sure that we avoid any confusion, misunderstanding, or any invalid assumptions, all of which can lead to what would be the antithesis of Tabyeen. While we do have a recap for each session, the recap is highly summarized. And in order to get the full nuance, the previous sessions will need to be consumed, studied, and reflected upon. Nevertheless, if I can get a loud salawat, we can move on with the recap.
اللهم صل
اللهم
على
صل على
محمد
محمد
وآل
وآل محمد
محمد.
وعجل فرجه.
So the previous session, we went in the footsteps of said Zaynab. In the 14th session of this Jihad of clarification, we turned our gaze towards a luminous yet often misunderstood pillar of divine resistance, said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her. We did not approach her merely as a bereaved sister, nor only as a captive woman of Karbala. We approached her as she revealed herself in the court of Yazid, as a hujjah, a clarifier, a preserver of divine wilaya, and a living extension of Imam Husayn's mission beyond the battlefield. The session sought to reclaim her legacy, not only from cultural sentimentalism, but from centuries of patriarchal distortion. We located her within the Quranic lineage of women entrusted with divine missions, from Sayyidah Maryam, peace and blessings be upon her, the mother of the Messiah, who was chosen above all women, to Sayyidah Asiya, who defied Pharaoh in his own palace, to the unnamed mother of Musa, or Moses, who was inspired by revelation, to the believing women of early Islam who bore witness to the truth despite the costs. In this constellation, Said Zaynab stood as the post-Ashura embodiment of this divine feminine strength, not merely complementary to Imam Husayn, but in fact integral to the completion and clarification of his sacrifice. We examined how her clarification, or her tabyeen, took form not in polemics, but in piercing words spoken in the epicenters of distortion. In Kufa and in Damascus, she overturned the narrative architecture of the oppressors with her truth. Her voice, forged in the fire of grief and certainty, did not waver when she uttered the immortal words, "I saw nothing but beauty." This was not poetic denial, rather it was theological resistance. It was wilaya speaking through a woman who had seen the blood of her sons and brothers flow like rivers, yet saw in it the justice of God. The discourse then turned to the qualities that made this Tabyeen possible. We explored the spiritual foundations of Sayyid Zaynab's mission, her proximity to the Ahl al-Bayt, her knowledge or ma'rifah, her patience or sabr, and her unshakable steadfastness, istiqamah. These were not accidental traits, but cultivated stations of the soul. A soul shaped by wilaya, refined by divine trials, and entrusted with the most sensitive portion of the Husayni mission, to carry the truth through chains, humiliation, and hostile audiences without allowing it to be distorted. We then position Sayyid Zaynab not just as a figure of the past, but as a living standard for our present. In a time where women are both objectified and marginalized, when slogans of freedom mask new forms of enslavement, her example breaks the binaries. She was neither veiled into silence nor unveiled into vulgarity. She was the speech of Imam Husayn made manifest, the veil of sanctity turned into a banner of defiance. She was the guardian of the message, not in hiding, but in confrontation. The session also reasserted that Tabyeen is not a male enterprise, it is a divine duty. Said Zaynab was not an anomaly, she was a prototype. The Ahl Bayt trained her, trusted her, and through her proved that womanhood in Islam, when rooted in divine purpose, becomes a vessel of revelation, not merely reception. The words of Imam Khomeini, Shahid Beheshti, and Shahid Mutahhari affirmed this, reclaiming the role of women as theological, moral, and political agents, not mere spectators to the struggle for truth. The session closed with the supplication eulogy titled, Zaynab is our witness. A whispered call from the plains of Karbala to the silence of Gaza, from the sanctity of the shrine to the numbness of our screens. It asked, do we walk like Sayyid Zaynab walked? Do we carry the burden of her chains? Or have we become content with tears that excuse inaction? In this haunting prayer, Sayyid Zaynab was not only remembered, she was invoked. She was not only eulogized, but she was called upon as a witness to our betrayal or our awakening. Therefore, part 14 was not a biography. It was in fact a mirror to reflect the weight of our responsibilities in an age where truth is veiled by spectacle, and where the pulpit, like the court of Yazid, is often used to sanctify oppression. It was a call to rise, not just in grief, but in clarity. Not just in love, but in allegiance. Not just in mourning, but in fact in Tabyeen. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the main section, which is the ink, the poem, and the witness.
اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد.
So, from the first moment of revelation to the last echo of divine discourse, the Quran is a book of inked words and eternal meanings. It is recitation or tilawa, and it is inscription, kitaba. It is heard by the ears of the humble and written by the pens of the purified. It is not just a book to be recited, it is a witness. God described the Quran as a shahid, as a shahid, a witness over the destinies of men. In Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 143, Allah says, therefore, we have made you a middle nation, that you may be witnesses to the people, and the messenger may be a witness to you. And more specifically, Imam Sadiq teaches us, and this is from Al-Kafi, and again, like with all of these sessions, there are extensive references, citations throughout in the write-up, which I encourage everyone to take a look at. So Imam Sadiq has said, the Quran is a witness, an intercessor whose intercession is accepted, and a prosecutor whose case is accepted. Whoever puts it in front of him, it will lead him to paradise, and whoever puts it behind him, it will drive him into the fire. Furthermore, the Quran is light that guides. In Quran, in Surah Shura, that chapter of the consultation, the 42nd chapter of the Quran, verse 52, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and thus we revealed to you a spirit of our command. You did not know what the book was, nor the faith, but we made it a light by which we guide whoever we wish of our servants. However, the Quran is not merely a guide. It is a recording witness, a source of truth, and a scale by which all claims are weighed. It testifies on behalf of those who lived by it and against those who betrayed it. In Quran, Surah Al-Furqan, the chapter of the criterion, 25th chapter of the Quran, verse number 30, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And the messenger will say, O my Lord, indeed my people have taken this Quran as a thing neglected." This verse reveals a divine complaint, not by man, but by the messenger of God himself. The people did not burn the Quran. They did not mock it openly, but they abandoned it. They left its meanings unpondered, its justice unimplemented, and its clarifications unspoken. The Quran speaks, it records, it stands in the divine court, and in fact, it bears witness. Let us now look at the idea of the inked word is not passive. Now, it is easy to imagine the Quran as only text, mute, still, confined to calligraphy or mushaf. But in the hadith of Ahl al-Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, the Quran is active, present, speaking, and alive. Imam as-Sadiq has said, the Quran is alive, it does not die. It flows as night and day flow. It flows as the sun and moon flow. It applies to our last generation as it applied to our first. Every verse carries within it the spirit of divine guidance, not frozen in time, but renewed in every age. This living quality gives the Quran its role as witness, not merely to what happened, but to what should have happened. It exposes negligence. It affirms sincerity. It judges in silence. Let's now look at why the witness needs a scribe. If the Quran is the ultimate witness, then those who write, recite, interpret, or carry its meaning, carry its message, become the scribes of the witness. Their ink is not neutral, and their silence is not without consequence. Imam Ali has said in Nahj Balagha, God did not take a covenant from the ignorant to learn until he took a covenant from the learned to teach. The same covenant applies to those who write poetry, who compose lamentations, who publish words in the name of Islam. They do not simply reflect, they amplify. They do not merely mourn, but they transmit testimony. And the Quran is the standard of truth, and it is the first of the witnesses. In the cosmology of Islam, everything will bear witness on the Day of Judgment. The limbs, the angels, the books, the records, the messengers. But the first and the greatest of these witnesses is the Quran itself. In Quran, in Surah Al-Zukhruf, the chapter of the ornaments, 43rd chapter of the Quran, verse 44, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Indeed, it is a reminder for you and your people, and soon you will be questioned." The one who forgets the Quran or abandons its message is not simply guilty of neglect. He is found wanting when the Quran is called to the witness stand. Let's now look at the first thing that God created, which was the pen. The Quran opens with an oath that trembles through the fabric of revelation. In Quran, Surah al-Qalam, the chapter of the pen, 68th chapter of the Quran, verse number 1. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he swears by the letter Noon. He says, Noon, by the pen and what they inscribe. This is not merely a symbolic verse. It is a declaration. God swears by the pen, not by the sword, not by a throne, not even by the Kaaba, but by the pen. Why? Because truth must be preserved and injustice must be recorded. The pen is the custodian of meaning. Without it, revelation would not be recited, law would not be preserved, and martyrdoms would be forgotten. Let's look at now the primordial pen, the first of God's creations. In the hadith of the Prophet and the Imams, peace and blessings be upon them all, it is narrated that the first thing God ever created was the pen. Before the universe, before the angels, before time, there was the instrument of recording. In Kitab al-Tawheed of Sheikh al-Saduq, the book of monotheism by Sheikh al-Saduq, he says, and again, all of the references and citations are in the write-up. He says, Sheikh al-Saduq narrates, the first thing God created was the pen. He said to it, write. It replied, what shall I write? He said, write the decree and all that shall be until the day of resurrection. This pen is not an earthly object. It is the metaphysical beginning, the instrument of divine will made visible. It is the pen of pre-eternal decree, qadar, and the register of creation, the script of destiny. And if we now look at the idea of the aql or intellect and the qalam, we see a parallel. Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq draws a deep connection between the pen or qalam and the intellect or aql. He says, indeed, the first thing God created was the intellect. He said to it, come forward, and it came forward. Then he said, withdraw, and it withdrew. He said, by my glory and majesty, I have not created anything more beloved to me than you, and I shall complete you only in those whom I love. Some narrations say the pen was first. Others say the intellect was first. The scholars reconcile this as not being a contradiction, but rather as a harmony. The qalam or the pen is the outward inscription of the aql of intellect. That which is known is written. That which is written is preserved. Let's now look at the divine command to write, a duty of transmission. The first verses of Revelation instruct the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, to, and this is from Surah Al-Alaq, the chapter of the clot, 96th chapter of the Quran, verses 3 and 4. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, recite, and your Lord is the most generous, the one who taught by the pen. This act of reading or qira'ah and the act of writing or kitaba are not separate within Islam. Revelation begins with the command to recite and is immediately followed by a reference to the pen, linking orality and literacy, spirit and form, message and medium. Let's now look at the weight of the scribe. He who writes for truth, for remembrance, for clarity, holds a rank in Islam. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, has said, whoever writes knowledge in Islam, the angel shall continue to seek forgiveness for him so long as that writing remains. This is the weight of ink. It can earn a person angelic intercession or divine rebuke. For the scribe who records falsehood, distorts religion, or beautifies sin, his pen becomes a witness against him. Please give me a salawat and we move to the idea of the weight of a word in the divine record.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
In the sight of men, a word may seem light, a fleeting sound, a line of ink, a momentary verse. But in the sight of God, every word is weighed. The Quran presents this truth with startling clarity. In Surah Al-Qaf, the chapter of the Qaf, 50th chapter of the Quran, verse number 14. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says, he does not utter a single word without a ready observer beside him. The scribal angels do not wait for actions, they record speech. The kalima or word carries a moral weight. A lie is not just a distortion of fact, it is an ink stain upon the soul. And a word of truth is not just a sound, it is in fact a seed in divine soil. So let's look at the word as deed, not just sound. So Islam does not treat words as immaterial. The Quran directly links speech to moral accountability, a reality often forgotten in a world drowning in slogans, songs, and spectacle. Again, the same verse we quoted earlier, Surah Qaf, the chapter of Qaf, 50th chapter of the Quran, verse number 18. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, he does not utter a single word without a ready observer beside him. Even the simplest utterance, sincere or sarcastic, whispered or broadcast, is recorded. These words are not echoes, they are inscriptions, and on the day of judgment, they will carry weight. In Quran, in Surah al-Qari'ah, the chapter of the striking calamity, 101st chapter of the Quran, verses 6 to 7, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "As for him whose scales are heavy with good, he shall be in a pleasing life." So the scale weighs meaning, not mass. Allama al-Tabyeen and other mufassirin exegetes in the Shia tradition explain that the mizan or scale in the Quran is not merely symbolic, nor is it based on physical mass. It is a true scale that weighs the moral gravity of actions, intentions, and words, measuring their nearness or distance from divine justice. In Al-Mizan, as summarized from al-Tabyeen, he says, "The scale in the Quran is a manifestation of divine justice, which weighs deeds by the truth they contain and their nearness to God, not merely by their outward form. Therefore, every spoken word, every inscribed verse, every recited line is not only preserved, it is weighed." So now let's look at words that rise or destroy. The Imams of the Ahl Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them all, warned explicitly of the power of the tongue and the weight of words in the scale of the hereafter. Imam as-Sadiq has said, and again, the references, citations are all within the write-up. I strongly recommend everyone to review the write-up. So Imam as-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, has said, "Indeed, a person may utter a single word that makes people laugh, and because of it, he plunges further in punishment than the distance between the earth and the sky." He also says, again, Imam as-Sadiq says, "Indeed, a person may utter a word by which he is raised in paradise many ranks, and a person may utter a word by which he falls into the fire for 70 years. And this 70 years is metaphorical, it just means a very long time. The word is therefore an action, and often a more permanent one than a fleeting deed. Words shape public opinion. They can incite rebellion, they can spread falsehood, or they can heal broken hearts. And for each function, they are weighed. Let's now look at the poet and the witness. Every artist or reciter who invokes the name of God or the Ahl Bayt must weigh his words with awe. The Quran warns. In Surah Safar, the chapter of the ranks, 37th chapter of the Quran, verse 24, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Stop them, for indeed they will be questioned." The question will not only be, what did you write? But it will be, why did you write it? What did it awaken in the people? Did it carry the trust of clarification or tabyeen? Or did it betray it? Let's now look at the danger of misused words and the responsibility of the poet. The one who writes, recites, or chants for an audience bears a heavier burden than the one who merely speaks privately. The Ahl Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them, warned us of the sins of the tongue and the pen. Imam as-Sadiq has said, "Indeed, a person may utter a single word that makes people laugh, and because of it, he plunges further in punishment than the distance between the earth and the sky." Every humorous line, every poetic metaphor, every artistic phrase must be measured. What truth does it convey? What ideology does it embed? What moral does it plant in the mind? Let's now look at Imam Husayn and said Zaynab, words that destroyed tyranny. But before that, please give me a loud salawat.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
One of the most powerful illustrations of the weight of a word comes from Karbala. On the day of Ashura, Imam Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, did not just fight, he spoke. He said, "If you have no religion and do not fear the hereafter, then at least be free in your world." This was not just a rhetorical gesture. It was a word that echoes through centuries, shaming every tyrant who sells his soul and inspiring every heart still capable of honor. When Said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her, stood in Yazid's court, her words carried more weight than swords. She said, "So scheme your schemes, exert your efforts, and do your worst. By God, you shall never erase our remembrance." These are not merely historical quotes. They are divine inscriptions in the ink of resistance. They prove that a word spoken with truth can outlive empire. Let's now look at the word as a witness and weight. What we write, what we share, what we chant, these are not empty expressions. They are deposited into the divine registry. And on the day when nothing remains but the soul and its record, the pen will speak louder than the tongue ever did. God says in Surah An-Nur, the chapter of light, 24th chapter of the Quran, 24th verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "The day their tongues, their hands, and their feet will bear witness against them for what they used to do." And the poet, the artist, the reciter, the mourner will be asked, "What did your words serve? Whom did your pen glorify?" So now let's have a look at a simple call to clarify. Because the way I've structured these sessions is at the end of each session, there's always a call to clarify because there's always work that we need to do. So the first call to clarify is, "O you who hold a pen, a mic, or a verse, know that you do not create in a vacuum." The first thing God created was the pen. He commanded it to write. The first command to the prophet was read. Together they show that divine guidance is both recorded and recited, that ink still flows through history, bearing witness to truth and falsehood, to sincerity and deception. The Quran is a witness. It speaks not only to the people of the past, but to the negligence of today. It is not merely to be recited, it is to be clarified, to be defended, and to be carried. The word is a deed. It is preserved, it is weighed and questioned. Even a jest can drag a soul into hell. Even a line of poetry can raise one to divine proximity. The scale does not weigh form, it weighs meaning, intent, and impact. So clarify. Speak only what you are willing to see placed on the scale of judgment. Write only what you are prepared to answer for before the one who never forgets. Let your ink weep when it must, but never lie. Let your silence be from humility, not from cowardice. And if your pen must rise, let it rise like said Zaynab in the tyrant's court, fearless, principled, and radiant with divine trust. In Quran, Surah Anbiya, the chapter of the prophets, 21st chapter of the Quran, verse 47, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And we shall set up the scales of justice on the day of resurrection, so no soul will be wronged in the least." Write only what you are willing to answer for before the one who taught by the pen. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the next section, which is the power of the poem, a universal tradition.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So poetry in Islam is not ornamental, it is foundational. From the earliest days of revelation, the Quran positioned itself as a divine discourse that transcended the art of human speech, especially poetry. And yet, it did not abolish poetry. Rather, it redefined it. It reoriented the purpose of language from self-glorification to divine remembrance, from entertainment to truth-telling. Let's look at the Quran between revelation and poetry. The disbelievers of Quraysh often accused the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, of being a poet. They did this not to honor him, but in fact to reduce him, to demean him. In pre-Islamic Arabia, poetry was revered as the highest form of expression, but also as a space of hyperbole, of romanticism, of tribal boasting, and idle entertainment. By accusing him of being a poet, they sought to undermine the authority of revelation, implying that it was merely another powerful form of verse. But the Quran rebuked this challenge very clearly. In Surah Yasin, the chapter of Yasin, 36th chapter of the Quran, verse number 69, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And we did not teach him poetry, nor does it befit him. It is nothing but a reminder and a clear Quran." This verse does not denigrate poetry itself. Rather, it distinguishes between divine revelation and human art. The Prophet was not sent to compete with poets. He was sent to realign language. He was sent to realign language with truth. The Quran, in its linguistic miracle, silenced the poets, not by erasing their tradition, but by purifying it. Let's now look at the poets who deviate and those who bear witness. The Quran continues its commentary on poets in Surah Al-Shu'ara, the chapter of the poets, first criticizing the majority, but then exempting a righteous minority. In Quran, Surah Al-Shu'ara, the chapter of the poets, 26th chapter of the Quran, verses 224 to 226, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And the poets, the deviant ones, follow them. Have you not seen that they roam aimlessly in every valley, and that they say what they do not do?" However, the next verse makes an exception, and this is verse number 227, again of Surah Shu'ara, 26th chapter of the Quran, chapter of the poets. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes an exception by saying, "Except those who believe, do righteous deeds, remember God much, and defend the truth after they were wronged. And those who wronged will know the outcome they shall meet." Therefore, the Quran lays out 4 conditions for poetic legitimacy. First one, faith or iman. The second one is righteous action. The third one is constant remembrance of God. And the fourth one is defending the truth after oppression. This is not condemnation, it is in fact curation. The Quran is not anti-poetry, it is anti-deception. Let's now look at the Ahlul Bayt and the sanctification of poetry. No school preserved, sanctified, and weaponized poetry more than the school of Ahlul Bayt, peace and blessings be upon them. For them, poetry was a means of mourning, of resistance, and indeed of Tabyeen or clarification. The 6th Imam, Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, has stated, "Whoever recites a single verse of poetry about us, meaning about Ahlul Bayt, God builds for him a house in paradise." And Imam al-Rida, peace and blessings be upon him, has said, "Whoever remembers our tragedy and weeps for what was done to us shall be with us on our level on the day of resurrection." These hadith did not merely permit poetry, they sanctified it as a type of ibadah or worship, when it flowed from love, from remembrance, and from struggle. The poet in this model becomes a mujahid of the tongue and of the pen. Let's now look at poets of resistance in Islamic history. From Kumayt al-Asadi to Da'bal al-Khuzai, the lineage of Shia resistance poets stretches back to the Umayyad era. These were not court poets seeking favor, but divine witnesses safeguarding the truth of Karbala. Kumayt, whose Al-Hashimiyat remains one of the most revered Shia poetic compilations, praised the Ahlul Bayt even at the risk of execution. When asked why he risked death, he replied, "I would rather die than see people like you being insulted from the pulpits." And when Da'bal recited his elegy before Imam al-Rida, peace and blessings be upon him, which read, "I see their share of rights and wealth divided amongst others, while their own hands are shackled from what is rightfully theirs." The Imam wept and prayed for him, saying, "May the doors of mercy always remain open for you, so long as you continue to defend us." These men were not entertainers. They were clarifiers of history, lovers of truth, and soldiers in the army of words. So let's now come to our next call to clarify, and let's reclaim the sacred art. Let the Ummah today remember, not every poem is poetry, and not every poet is the clarifier. In an age of idle lyrics and self-obsessed verse, we are in dire need of poetry that serves the truth. Let those with the gift of language return to the path of the righteous poets. Let the poem carry the burden of Imam Husayn. Let the verse echo the voice of Said Zaynab, and let the rhyme be a sword against distortion. And let the gatherings of mourning once again become gatherings of witnessing, where the ink and the tear walk hand in hand. O God, make our tongues proclaimers for truth, and our pens witnesses for your wilayah, and our poetry arrows in the chest of your enemies. Please give me a salawat, and we move on to the global language of lament.
اللهم صل على محمد ومحمد.
In every age, when justice was trampled and blood flowed unseen by the world, the broken turned to poetry. Not the poetry of aesthetics or abstraction, but the kind that emerges from the wound, raw, defiant, drenched in grief. Whether sung, whispered, or wept, lament has always been the global tongue of the oppressed. The Quran affirms the legitimacy of grief, not as a weakness, but as a sacred expression. Consider the grief of Prophet Yaqub, Jacob, who lost his beloved son, Prophet Joseph. In Quran, in Surah Yusuf, the chapter of Prophet Joseph, the 12th chapter of the Quran, verse 84, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about Yaqub, about Jacob, his eyes turned white with grief, for he suppressed his sorrow. And what was the cry of the prophets and the imams in the face of tyranny, if not a divine lament? Imam as-Sadiq has declared, weeping for the oppressed is a form of support for them. It is in this light that Sayyid Zaynab's voice, I saw nothing but beauty, becomes not only a theological statement, but a revolutionary poem in the court of tyranny. Let's now look at From Karbala to Chile, lamentation as resistance. Across the continents and civilizations, we see the emergence of mourning verse as a form of protest. You have Palestine. Mahmoud Darwish, exiled and wounded, transformed loss into poetry. He says in his poem called A State of Siege, we suffer from an incurable malady, hope. In Latin America, in the wake of dictatorship and exile, poets like Pablo Neruda wrote elegies for the disappeared. You can cut all the flowers, but you cannot keep spring from coming. And this is from his famous poem, The Spring. In Black America, the enslaved sang spirituals that wept for justice. Nobody knows the troubles I've seen. Nobody knows but Jesus. In pre-Islamic Arabia, the poet Al-Khansa wept for her brother Sakha in verses that pierced generations. Later, she accepted Islam after meeting Prophet Muhammad. She became devout, and she gave her 4 sons as martyrs in the Battle of Qadisiyah, which is the battle when the Muslims conquered Iran or Persia. On hearing of their martyrdom, she declared, praise be to God who honored me with their martyrdom. I hope my Lord will unite me with them in the abode of his mercy. And if you want to know more about Al-Khansa or the Battle of Qadisiyah, there are footnotes within the write-up that will give more information. And then you have Karbala. And in Karbala, the most enduring epic of grief, the Marthiyah, the Noha, and the Ziyara became a divine inheritance, not just for the Shia, but for the world. As Imam Khamenei has said, religious poetry preserves truths and has the power to awaken consciences. So now let's look at the clarifying power of sacred grief. This poetry is not merely therapeutic. It is clarifying. It tells the world what the history books try to forget. It speaks when the news channels are silent. It cries out that the child in Gaza is not collateral, but a martyr. That the screams of said Zaynab was not despair, but defiance. That the tear of Imam Sajjad was not surrender, but it was testimony. Imam Khomeini, may God rest his pure soul, once said, these tears, these mourning ceremonies, these elegies and chest beating rituals, they are the secret of our doctrine's survival. And indeed, what clearer Tabyeen can there be than forcing the world to face the wound it tries to ignore and declaring this pain will not be erased. Let's now look at the poem is a witness. Every poetic lament becomes a witness, a martyr without blood. It testifies to what was done, what was silenced, what was denied. As Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, may God rest his pure soul, once stated, the Husseini poem does not merely weep, it indicts, it convicts, and it mobilizes. It is for this reason that tyrants fear poets, that Yazid silenced the voice of the Prophet not just through killing, but through distortion. The colonialists burnt books and banned elegies. And today, algorithms suppress the sound of Gaza's children while amplifying the voices of their killers. But the lament continues, in whispers, in marches, and in rhythmic defiance. And let's have a look at our call to clarify over here, reviving the tongue of lament. People should revive the tradition of sacred lament in every language and form. Write lamentations on Noha. Write elegies for Palestine, for Kashmir, for Yemen, for Sudan, for Lebanon, for the oppressed everywhere. Let the poetry of Imam Husayn become the global tongue of protest. Host poetry circles and cultural nights that connect historical mourning with present resistance. Let the voice of said Zaynab be heard beside the voice of the mothers of Gaza. Use media and AI tools not to replace the soul, but to amplify the voices of those who still have one. Teach youth that writing is jihad, and that tears are their ink. Translate and disseminate the words of scholars who have defended the sacred lament. People like Shaykh Mutahari, Shaykh Beheshti, Imam Khomeini, Sayyid Hassan, Sayyid Nasrullah, Imam Khomeini, Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, people like Ayatollah Jawadi Amuli, Shaykh al-Iraqi, and others, and reconnect art with wilaya. And bear witness through beauty, and never let the world forget. In Quran we say, Surah Al-Imran, 3rd chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the family of Imran, verse 169, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do not think those who were slain in the path of God are dead. Rather, they are alive, receiving their provision from their Lord. The martyrs live, and the poem is their voice. Please give me a salawat, and we now look at the idea of ziyarah, the poem of presence.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So ziyarah is not simply travel, it is testimony. When we approach the shrines of the prophets and the imams, or even recite their visitation or ziyarah from afar, we are not tourists of holiness. We are walking into a poem that has not yet ended, into a lament that is still unfolding, into a pledge that is still echoing. Ziyad Ashura, we say, peace be upon you, O Aba Abdullah, and upon the souls that gathered around your courtyard. Upon you, from me, is the peace of God, for as long as I remain and as long as night and day endure. This is not prose. It is a poetic oath, a lifelong pledge, ritually repeated and existentially renewed. And the ziyarah is actually Quranic. The Quran invites the believer not only to remember the righteous, but to seek their company. In Quran, Surah Tawbah, the chapter of repentance, 9th chapter of the Quran, verse 119, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and be with the truthful. And it affirms that the righteous are not truly dead. Again, Surah Al-Imran, the chapter of the family of Imran, 3rd chapter of the Quran, verse 169. Do not think of those who were slain in the path of God as dead. Rather, they are alive, receiving provision from their Lord. Therefore, to greet Imam Husayn is to greet the living, and to walk to Karbala or recite his name with presence is to enter the circle of truth. Let's now look at the rhythmic theology of ziyarah. Ziyarah texts are very carefully crafted. They rhyme, they repeat, they crescendo, they invoke the divine and they denounce the tyrant. They mourn and they mobilize. In this sense, ziyarah is poetry, but not for beauty alone. It is poetry that testifies. For example, in Ziyad Ashura, we say, I am at peace with those at peace with you, and at war with those who are at war with you. Again, this is not metaphor. It is allegiance in the form of a verse. Let's now look at ziyarah as defiance. When said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her, stood in the court of Yazid, she offered the greatest ziyarah of all, a presence that exposed falsehood without raising a weapon. Her sermon was structured like poetry, rhythm, repetition, rhetorical crescendo. And Imam Khamenei affirms, ziyarah is not merely remembrance, it is the reconstruction of faith and identity. And Ayatollah Beheshti, Shaykh Beheshti once said, every step towards Karbala is a stride upon the path of truth. So let's look at from distance with presence. Even when distant, the ziyarah still brings us near. Imam as-Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, has said, whoever visits Husayn recognizing his right, it is as though he has visited God upon his throne. Therefore, ziyarah is not about geography. It's about recognition, about intent, and about poetic clarity. Let's have a look at our call to clarify over here. Recite the poem of presence. We should revive the ziyarah as a daily act, not just a ritual for special occasions. We should encourage the youth to memorize and internalize its language until it becomes part of their moral grammar. The texts of ziyarah should be translated into poetry in local languages while preserving their theological depth. The soul of Tabyeen must speak in every tongue. Alhamdulillah, this has already been started with Ziyad Ashura as the communion of Ashura and Ziyad Arbaeen as the communion of Arbaeen into English. But these should not be direct literal translations, and these aren't. They are poetic, interpretive, and inspirational translations. We should design cultural spaces where ziyarah can be recited with reflection, art, and tears, not as performance, but as presence. And we should integrate ziyarah into resistance media, into spoken word, digital art, dramas, movies, and documentaries that reclaim the poem of presence in a world that numbs and forgets. And we should stand even when distant, recite the ziyarah in presence, in exile, in mourning, and in joy. Let every whisper of peace be upon you, O Aba Abdullah, become a blow against the silence. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the subject of nasheed, noha, and music between ritual and revolution.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So sound is not a passive phenomenon in Islamic thought. It stirs hearts, incites emotions, shapes memory, and commands the soul. From the recitation of Quran to the chants of a protest march, from the sorrowful rhythms of a noha or lamentation to the battle cries of a nasheed or anthem, sound is a force. And like all forces, it can heal or it can harm. It can illuminate or it can distort. The Quran reminds us of the subtle power of the human voice. In Quran, Surah Luqman, the chapter of Luqman, 31st chapter of the Quran, verse 19, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and lower your voice. Indeed, the most repugnant of voices is the braying of donkeys. This is not merely about etiquette. It is about recognizing that voice, like ink, is not neutral. It has a spiritual effect. It has weight. Imam Sadiq has said, singing or ghina causes hypocrisy to grow in the heart, just as water causes crops to grow. Now, this hadith, contrary to the opinion of some, is not a condemnation of all melody, but of a specific type called ghina, a term with a technical, juristic meaning. Not every tune is unlawful, but every tune is morally charged. Let's clarify the rulings about ghina, lahu, and lahan, about music. Islamic jurists across the centuries have wrestled with the boundaries of music, melody, and emotion. The key terms used in Shia jurisprudence are ghina, which is prohibited singing that is vain, frivolous, or associated with gatherings of sin. Lahu, which is diversion or idle amusement that distracts from the remembrance of God. And lahan, which is melody or rhythm, which can be neutral or praiseworthy depending on the context. According to Imam Khamenei, any sound that produces an atmosphere of frivolity or is suited to gatherings of vice is forbidden, even if its content is good. Ayatollah Sistani similarly writes, if singing or music is suited to gatherings of amusement and sin, it is not permissible to listen to it or engage with it. This distinction matters. Not all melody is forbidden. What matters is the effect, context, and cultural association. Just as a vessel of glass can hold pure water or deadly poison, music is a medium, not a substance. It can carry the remembrance of God or the call to heedlessness. Its moral character depends on what it contains, how it is delivered, and what it awakens in the listener. Melody in and of itself is not evil, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a tool of distortion. In the right hands, it becomes a stairway to divine presence. Let's now look at nasheed and noha, sounds with soul. In Islamic tradition, and especially within the Shia paradigm, certain sound forms have always been sanctified. You have the nasheed, chants or odes or anthems with noble themes, historically used to prepare hearts for battle or spiritual upliftment. You then have noha, which are rhythmic elegies that express sorrow for the Ahl Bayt, especially the martyrs of Karbala. And you have latmiya or lamentation, which is chest beating accompanied by chants of mourning, rooted in the grief of said Zaynab and Imam Sajjad. These are not mere performances. They are in fact forms of ibadah or worship. They are an emotional tafsir, an emotional exegesis, and they are cultural tabyeen. Imam Khomeini described the significance of these acts. These elegies, these cries, these chest beatings, they are what have preserved our country. They are not music in the secular sense. They are structured grief turned into spiritual power. Let's now look at between consolation and confusion, the psychological dimension. There is a danger, however, in crossing the line from soulful rhythm to seductive entertainment. Many modern noha borrow from pop or Bollywood structures, with high production, auto-tuned vocals, and emotional crescendos that induce trance rather than tafakkur or reflection. Ayatollah Misbah Yazdi, may God rest his pure soul, warned, if noha becomes like entertaining music, a person, instead of reflecting on the tragedy, experiences emotional deviation. This is not an attack on aesthetics. It is a defense of sincerity. The sound must match the sorrow. The beat must serve the blood. The tear must lead to clarification, not to confusion. Let's now look at some case studies where sound became clarification. So first of all, in Iraq, during Saddam's brutal crackdown, underground nohas preserved the resistance of the Hausa. At a time where the shrines were surrounded and the pulpits were silenced, voices like Basim al-Karbala'i, became lifelines of faith and defiance, echoing the spirit of Karbala through cassettes smuggled into homes. While in recent years his work has entered more commercial terrain, it cannot be denied that in those days his voice carried the hopes of a shackled ummah. And then you have in Bahrain, especially during the 2011 uprising and its aftermath, No has shifted from abstract sorrow to sharp protest, blending mourning with mobilization. The Majalis became a space not only of grief but of strategy, where the elegy became resistance and the rhythm became a reminder. In the wider diaspora, efforts to create meaningful Noha in English have multiplied. Groups such as, for example, Pure Stream, Haidari Voices, and 313 Nasheed have sought to bridge authenticity and accessibility. Some succeed in transmitting both pain and purpose. Others, unfortunately, fall into the trap of mimicry, adopting borrowed forms and phrases without any real spiritual resonance. Worthy of special mention is the pioneering work of The Dawn, a British Muslim group from the 1990s, who produced the first fully English language Noha, Shaheed of Karbala, and the first English language Nasheed, The Purest Soul. These were not translations. They were native poetic creations, written in organic British English, rooted in the cultural idiom of the West, but carrying the ideological weight of the East. Let's now look at a call to clarify. Let your voice be a witness. So first of all, educate the youth on the rulings, not to suppress their voice, but to purify it. Explain the difference between soul and spectacle. Train poets, composers, and reciters to study fiqh, history, and psychology, so that their art becomes tabyeen, not distortion. Compose new Noha and Nasheed for the forgotten, for Gaza, for Nigeria, for Yemen, for Afghanistan, for the children aborted across the country, for the elderly being put in nursing homes and being asked to die. Let the tears of Karbala flow across centuries and continents. Build online platforms where verified, spiritually sound Noha, Nasheed, and more can be accessed. Free from ads, free from distortion and triviality. One such platform has recently launched by the name of Shia Sounds. Lead by example. Recite with humility, with haiba, yani with awe, with reverence, with dignity and respect, with clarity. Let the sound shake thrones, not just move crowds. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the witness, Said Zaynab and Imam Sajjad.
اللهم صل
اللهم صل على محمد وآل
على محمد.
محمد وعجل فرجهم.
When the dust of Karbala settled, it was not over. The bodies lay still, but the mission lived on, in the voice of Said Zaynab and in the silence of Imam Sajjad. In the aftermath of the massacre, two figures carried the divine banner of Tabyeen. They did not merely survive the catastrophe, they clarified its meaning to the world. Imam Husayn, peace and blessings be upon him, had bled truth into the soil. But it was Said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her, who spoke the truth aloud, and Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him, who preserved it in his prayers, tears, and his teachings. Their roles were not incidental. They were divinely appointed witnesses, as the Quran describes in Surah Al-Baqarah, second chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the cow, verse 143. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "And thus we made you a middle nation, that you may be witnesses over mankind, and that the messenger may be a witness over you." Sayyid Zaynab and Imam Sajjad were the witness-bearing pair. Like Prophet Musa and Harun, like Ibrahim and Ismail, testifying to God's justice in the face of tyranny. Let's now look at Sayyid Zaynab and the sermon that shook empires. Dragged in chains, veiled in grief, and surrounded by the heads of her family, Sayyid Zaynab entered Yazid's court not as a captive, but as living proof against falsehood. Her sermon, preserved in Al-Ihtijaj and in Lahuf, was the voice of Wilayah defying the throne of corruption. She declared, "So scheme your schemes, and strive your striving, and exhaust your efforts. For by God, you shall never erase our remembrance, nor shall you cause the revelation to die. With a single speech, she exposed Yazid's mockery and lineage of disbelief. She reframed the events of Karbala as divine beauty, where she said, I saw nothing but beauty. And she affirmed the message of Imam Husayn would outlive the empire that martyred him. Her voice pierced history, echoing the words of Sayyidah Maryam before her people, and Sayyidah Asiya before Pharaoh. It was a moment when a woman became the tongue of divine protest. Let's now look at Imam Sajjad and the silent earthquake. While Sayyid Zaynab thundered from the pulpit, Imam Zayn al-Abidin brought down empires through worship, patience, and strategic silence. His words were rare, but each one was a dagger against distortion. In the court of Ibn Ziyad, when threatened with death, he replied, "Do you threaten me with death? Do you not know that killing us is our custom, and that martyrdom is our honor from God?" And in Damascus, when Yazid mockingly allowed him to speak, the Imam delivered a sermon of pure light, introducing himself, his lineage, and the crimes committed by the Umayyads. He concluded by asking, "O people, whoever knows me, and whoever does not, let me introduce myself by my lineage." What followed was a genealogical refutation of Yazid's legitimacy, a reminder that while Yazid sat upon the throne, the real authority lay with the family of the Prophet. Witnessing as a divine task. The Quran constantly speaks of shuhada, martyrs, not just those martyred in battle, but those who bear witness to the truth. The role of witness is a spiritual trust. Said Zaynab and Imam Sajjad embodied this trust in three ways. Firstly, they clarified the distortion of events. They unmasked Yazid's propaganda. Secondly, preserving the memory of Karbala through sermons, dua, and historical consciousness. And three, guiding future generations. Their words were not just rebuttals, they were templates for resistance. This is why we recite in Ziyarat Nahiya al-Muqaddasa, because it carries the spirit of their witness. Ziyarat Nahiya is attributed to be from Imam al-Hujjah, Imam Mahdi. May our souls be his ransom and may God hasten his return. In Ziyarat Nahiya we say, "Though fate delayed me and circumstances prevented me from fighting for you, I shall mourn you morning and evening and weep tears of blood in place of tears." This ziyarah itself is a model of witness, an act of tabyeen from the unseen Imam, who reminds us that remembrance is a form of participation and grief can be testimony. And now to our call to clarify, where we become a witness. To witness is not merely to see, it is to speak, to record, to refuse to forget. Every believer today is offered this role. Speak when truth is hidden. Weep when injustice is normalized. Create, write, recite, so that the light of Hussein does not dim. In a world where Yazid wears many masks, where tyranny speaks the language of freedom and injustice disguises itself in piety, we must become like said Zaynab and Imam Sajjad. Silent when silence is divine, and thunderous when speech becomes worship. O God, let us be witnesses, not of bloodshed, but of meaning, not of trauma, but of truth. Let our pens become the echoes of Sayyid Zaynab, and let our prayers become the tears of Imam Sajjad, so that when history repeats, your proof will not be absent. Please give me a salawat and we look at the age of artificial sound, poetry in the age of machines.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So we live in an age where a poem can be composed without a poet. A noha can be recited without a mourner. And even grief can be simulated with synthetic tears. But as the lines blur between human and machine, we must ask with clarity and courage, who speaks and who feels? This is not merely a question of aesthetics or innovation. It is a question of truth, of moral weight, of divine accountability. In Islam, sound is not sacred by default. Sincerity is. And the spoken word carries meaning only when anchored in the soul. Let's look at the divine weight of a word. Speech in the Quran is a trust. The believer is not merely encouraged to speak truth, but to be rooted in it. In Quran, Surah Ibrahim, the chapter of Prophet Ibrahim, 14th chapter of the Quran, verse 27. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, God makes firm those who believe with the firm word in the life of this world and in the hereafter. This firm word, al-Qawl al-Thabit, is not merely articulate. It is alive. It emerges from a soul that trembles before God, that bears witness to the truth. Can a machine, no matter how articulate, bear such witness? The voice of said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her, in the court of Yazid was not scripted or digitized. It was a trembling, defiant flame of wilaya lit from Karbala. The lament of Imam Sajjad, peace and blessings be upon him, was not an audio file. It was a whisper of broken ribs and enduring hope. These are not sounds to be simulated. These are legacies to be honored. Let's look at the soul of the voice. Imam as-Sadiq has taught, indeed, the heart, when devoid of the remembrance of God, becomes dark. A synthetic heart cannot remember God. A digital mouth cannot tremble. It is remembrance, dhikr, that gives light to speech, not rhythm. In our sacred tradition, the power of words lies not in tone, but in truth. Let's now look at Imam Khamenei, may God preserve him, on AI, where he says, master it, do not be mastered. Faced with the meteoric rise of artificial intelligence, Imam Khamenei has offered believers a clear directive. Do not merely consume this technology, understand it, master it, and shape it with your values. He says, today artificial intelligence is progressing at an astonishing speed. In the matter of AI, merely being a user is no advantage. This technology has deep layers that must be mastered, and those layers are currently in the hands of others. This is not a rejection of innovation. It is a call to clarify its purpose and direction. The Imam's words urge us not to become echo chambers of others' values, but active shapers of technological frontiers with akhlaq, hikmah, and wilaya. Let's now look at the ethics of imitation. To simulate the voice of a shaheed, the lament of a mother in Gaza, or the noha of an oppressed believer is not a neutral act. It is to risk turning sacred grief into empty spectacle. There is a very famous hadith, both in the Sunni books and in the Shia books. The references, again, are in the write-up. And the hadith says, whoever imitates a people is considered one of them. What then of those who digitally imitate the voices of divine witness while being disconnected from their spirit? Let's clarify the role of AI. Artificial intelligence can be a powerful tool, but it must never become the witness. The Quran declares, Surah Al-Baqarah, second chapter of the Quran, the chapter of the cow, verse 143, Allah Ta'ala says, thus we made you a middle nation, that you may be a witness over mankind. Witnessing is a human duty. It is a moral posture. It is not a mechanical function. If technology is to serve Islam, It must do in submission, not substitution. Let's have a look at our call to clarify over here, leveraging AI without losing the soul. O clarifier of truth, if you must use machines, then use them in wilaya of your conscience. Let your voice be amplified, not replaced. Let AI serve your sincerity, not obscure it. Let no digital echo ever speak on behalf of a soul that has not suffered, prayed, or wept. Heed the guidance of your Imam. Learn the layers, master the tools, but never forget the source of real meaning, the trembling heart before God, because only the heart that feels has the right to speak. Please give me a salawat and we move on to memory, meaning, and machine-made mourning.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
In a world where algorithms can imitate lament and neural networks can compose eulogies, the line between remembrance and performance begins to fray. What happens when mourning is no longer an act of the soul, but a service delivered by an app? Digital platforms now recommend pre-recorded du'as for grief, auto-generated poetry based on keywords like Karbala or loss or martyrdom, and even create synthetic voices that can recite Noha in the tone of famous reciters. Yet the question remains, is this remembrance or is it simulation? In Islamic tradition, dhikr, or remembrance, is not simply a repetition of sacred names. It is the intentional rekindling of meaning through presence. When said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her, wept beside the body of her brother, it was not performative. It was not for content. It was not for virality. It was witness. It was covenant. Let's have a look at the algorithm's blind spot. Artificial intelligence learns patterns. It does not feel pain. It detects structure, but it cannot taste sincerity. It can reproduce the tone of a weeping voice without ever knowing what it means to bury a child or to tremble before God. The Quran makes a profound distinction between knowing and remembering. In Quran, Surah Al-Hashr, the chapter of the exile, 59th chapter of the Quran, verse 19, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, "And do not be like those who forgot God, so we made them forget themselves." To forget God is not just to lose contact with the divine. It is to lose touch with who you are. Mourning without memory is not mourning. Artificial sorrow, detached from presence and submission, risks becoming spiritual self-forgetting. Let's have a look at the ritual of remembering. In our mourning rituals, from the majalis to Noha, from latmiyat to ziyara, the act of remembrance is not therapeutic theatre. It is ibadah or worship, it is wilaya or loyalty, and it is tabyeen or clarification. This is why Imam Sadiq, peace and blessings be upon him, has said, "Every breath you take in remembering our affair is counted as a good deed for you." This type of remembrance cannot be outsourced. It is the breath of love and allegiance. It cannot be uploaded. It must be lived. Let's now look at the threat of confusion. When machine-generated mourning becomes widespread, two grave dangers emerge. Number one, the confusion of authenticity. Youth may no longer distinguish between real tears and synthetic sobs. A deeply moving Noha might not come from a poet or believer, but from a machine fine-tuned on hashtags and sentiment analysis. Number two, the dilution of intent. The act of lament, a sacred form of clarifying truth, risks becoming just another mood in a content feed. Mourning becomes performative. Remembrance becomes background noise. We are not Luddites, people who are against technology. We are not Luddites. We are clarifiers. And in our Jihad of Tabyeen, we must distinguish between what honors memory and what hijacks it. Let's now have our next call to clarify, which is protecting the soul of mourning. O servant of Husayn, your tears are not data. Your grief is not an algorithm. Your mourning is not content, it is covenant. If you use AI, let it serve remembrance, not replace it. Use it to organize your archives, not erase your memory. Use it to share ziyarah, not simulate sincerity. Let no machine mourn on your behalf, because only a heart that remembers can truly cry, and only a soul that weeps with meaning can clarify the truth. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the ethics of voice and silence.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
So in the era of artificial sound, the question is no longer just who speaks, but rather who has the right to speak, and perhaps more critically, who must remain silent. As deepfake technology grows more precise, we are now standing at a precipice where sacred voices can be imitated, sermons re-engineered, and nohas recited by synthetic clones of beloved reciters, all without their consent or even after their death. What begins as an act of admiration can easily slip into spiritual trespass. Let's look at the right to voice. In Islamic tradition, voice is not public property. It is a trust. The human voice is sanctified by its association with intention, piety, and truth. To use someone's voice, especially to imitate it in sacred settings, is to walk the line between benefit and betrayal. Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, has said, "A person is hidden beneath his tongue." To clone a person's voice is to expose what was hidden. To do so without their permission or against their legacy is to commit a theft of niyyah or intention. Let's now look at when silence is sunnah. In this technological storm, it is not only speech that must be ethical, silence too must be clarified. There is a sunnah in silence, a wisdom in restraint. Just because we can replicate does not mean that we should. Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, has said, and I have two hadiths, one from Sunni sources, one from Shia sources. The one from the Sunni sources reads, "Whoever remains silent is saved." And from the Shia sources, "Safety lies in silence." Again, all of the references and everything are in the write-up. I encourage everyone to take a look. In a time where machines can fill every gap with speech, our act of not simulating a martyr's lament, not faking the sob of a mother, not generating a sermon in the tone of a dead alim or a dead scholar, may itself be a form of wilayah and wafa, or loyalty. Imam Khamenei, let's now look at Imam Khamenei on the sanctity of influence. Imam Khamenei has warned against powerful tools to become tools of deception. On many occasions, he has reminded the Ummah that the tools of modernity must remain truth-aligned. He says, "In cultural work, the most important thing is sincerity. Without sincerity, everything becomes its opposite." This warning applies acutely to voice synthesis and generative media. Sincerity is the scale. Without it, aid becomes abuse, and clarification becomes confusion. Let's now look at our next call to clarify, guarding the sacred right to speak. O you who mourn and recite, in this new battlefield of voices, do not become a thief of trust. Do not use a martyr's voice without his permission. Do not generate a lament without its weight. Use the tongue of truth, not the code of deception. Let silence be your teacher when the tools in your hands feel too powerful. And remember, not every voice that is heard has spoken, and not every silence is empty. Please give me a salawat, and we now look at a number of case studies for when ink, poem, and the witness changed the world. Please give me a loud salawat.
اللهم صل
اللهم
على
صل على
محمد
محمد
وآل
وآل
محمد.
محمد وعجل.
So history is not changed by slogans alone. It is shaped by voices, trembling, defiant, enduring, that carry truth through the storm. Some people wrote it, some sang it, some lived it, chained and bleeding, but all of them clarified. All of them bore witness. This is their echo. So firstly, ink, when the pen became the sword. The oppressors feared no weapon more than the pen held by a believer with yaqeen, or certainty, or conviction. Let's first look at William Tyndale, Ink Against the Empire. William Tyndale translated the Bible into English in the 16th century, defying the church-state monopoly that kept scripture hidden behind the language Latin. His pen ignited a reformation. For this act of truth-telling, he was strangled and burnt. You can find in Fox's Book of Martyrs, Tyndale is quoted as saying, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life ere many years, I will cause a boy that driveth the plough to know more of the scripture than thou dost." His ink shattered the illusion that access to divine truth must be mediated by power. It was Tabyeen, written in blood. Let's now look at Sayyid Qutb, Milestones from the Gallows. In the cold cells of Nasr's Egypt, Sayyid Qutb wrote Milestones on the Path, a manifesto of Islamic revival and a scathing indictment of jahili, or ignorant, decadent modernity. He writes, "The battle between Islam and ignorance is ongoing and has not ended, and will not end until God raises this religion and makes it prevail over others." Now, though controversial in its interpretations, Qutb's ink became a rallying point for Muslims worldwide, confronting despotism and cultural decay. Next, let's look at Sayyidah Amina bint al-Huda al-Sadr, the pen of dignity in Iraq. Under the shadow of Saddam's tyranny, Sayyidah bint al-Huda used stories, essays, and sermons to awaken the Islamic conscience of Iraqi women. As the editor of Al-Adwa magazine, she wrote fiction that combined moral insight with revolutionary courage. In an editorial in Al-Adwa in 1979, she wrote, "The Muslim woman is not a concubine. She is a free human being with a divine mission." She and her brother, Ayatollah Sayyid Muhammad Baqir al-Sadr, were martyred together in 1980, both of them executed for their pens. Let's now go to Southeast Asia and look at Kartini, the daughter of Java and the Letters of Awakening. Living under Dutch colonial rule in Indonesia, Kartini used her letters to challenge, with dignity, Western narratives of Muslim backwardness and to demand women's education rooted in honor, not imitation. She writes in Letters of a Javanese Princess, translated by Agnes Summers. Again, the citations references are all inside the write-out. She writes, "After darkness comes light." Her writings clarified that reform did not mean imitation, it meant revival. Her ink became the seed of Islamic awakening in Southeast Asia. Let's now look at Dr. Ali Shariati, the sociologist of Ashura. Ali Shariati fused Quranic thought with revolutionary fire. His pen reframed Karbala not as a tragedy, but as resistance. He wrote, "Every day is Ashura, every land is Karbala." Dr. Shariati taught that ink is not passive. It must disturb false comforts. It must awaken the slumbering and clarify that every tyrant wears the face of Yazid. Next, we have Jalal al-Ahmad, Westoxification and the Cultural War. In his seminal work, Gharzadagi, or Westoxification, al-Ahmad describes colonial influence not just as military, but as a spiritual disease. He writes, Westoxification means the paralysis of our spirit. He warned that language, culture, and ink were not neutral. Whoever controls the narrative controls destiny. Let's now move on to poem, where rhythm became revolution. Where ink carved the message, poem breathed life into it. Poetry has always been the soul of the ummah, of people, the language of longing and the rhythm of revolt. From the chains of prison to the soil of Karbala, resistance has always sung. So let's look at a number of case studies over here. But please give me a salawat before that.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل.
So the first one we have is Bobby Sands, the poet in the prison cell. During his hunger strike against British occupation in Northern Ireland, Bobby Sands wrote poems on toilet paper and smuggled them out of the Maze prison. His words awakened a sleeping world. He wrote, "Let our revenge be the laughter of our children." He died after 66 days without food, but his poem became the voice of a nation. Next, we have Faiz Ahmed Faiz, the sorrow of the oppressed set to verse. He was a master of Urdu resistance poetry. Faiz wrote with sorrowed sabr, or patience, and unwavering truth. His work was banned, his pen was surveilled, yet his poems became the anthem of revolution from Lahore to Beirut. He wrote in Dast Sabah, "Surely we too shall witness." His verses live on in every land where oppression still walks. Next, we have Shahid Murtada Mutahari, the philosopher of the poetic word. Though generally known as a scholar, Shahid Murtada Mutahari, his writings carried the cadence of the Quran and the passion of poetry. In Insan Basar Nivisht, Man and Destiny, he made poetry out of moral clarity. He said, "If nations awaken, no power can stop them." He showed that the line between ideology, aqidah, and emotion was never meant to be severed. Next, let's look at Haj Sadiq Ahangaran, the voice of the sacred defense. In the trenches of the Iran-Iraq war, Ahangaran's noha were not just performances, they were clarifications. His chants wept for the martyrs, rallied the troops, and summoned God's name in the language of blood and rhythm. A line from a very famous noha of his is, "O army of the Master of Time, be ready, be ready, be ready." He clarified that poetry can be a weapon, so long as it bleeds with truth. Next, you have Muhammad Husayn Kuwaitipur, the martyr poet. Before falling on the battlefield, Kuwaitipur composed a verse that united ishq and istiqamah, divine love and defiance, steadfastness. His famous line still lives on, "I ask of this world nothing but martyrdom." His poems were not metaphors, they were premonitions. You then have Hamid Zamani, the anthem of Quranic resistance. Zamani's music blends Quranic metaphors with revolutionary defiance. His voice became the soundtrack of the youth who sought clarity and conviction. He wrote, "We are not the people of Kufa that Ali should be left alone." Through rhythm, he reminded a generation that wilaya is not just a slogan, it is a vow. Next, we have Sheikh Hussein al-Akraf, the cry of the Gulf. From Bahrain, Sheikh Hussein al-Akraf's noha exposed injustice and rekindled faith. His lament for the oppressed Shia of Arabia thundered across the digital airwaves. He wrote, "Oppressed, oppressed, we are the oppressed of this world." His voice gave clarity to the pain they tried to silence. Next, you have Firqat al-Isra, the minstrels of wilaya and defiance. A Lebanese youth collective grounded in Quranic symbolism and revolutionary identity. Firqat al-Isra fuses poetic nasheed with digital clarity, confronting Zionism, cultural imperialism, and spiritual apathy through performance and production. Their famous nasheed, Death to Israel, is not a chant of hatred. It is a cry of witness, rooted in Quranic justice and the legacy of Karbala. They say, God has permitted us to cry out, death to Israel. In this track, the performers shift between lament and resistance, invoking Quranic verses of divine permission for defense and declaring their loyalty to the oppressed from Yemen to Palestine. The nasheed fuses melody with clarity, reminding the ummah that poetry is not entertainment, it is a form of tabyeen. They're quoted as saying, our words are swords, our voices are jihad. This is not incitement, it is inheritance. From Labbayka ya Zaynab to al-Mawt al-Israel, they carry the poetic banner of wilaya, truth, and the refusal to remain silent. Next you have Firqat al-Wilaya, the anthemists of dignity and defiance. Formed in the crucible of resistance in Lebanon, Firqat al-Wilaya channels Quranic imagery and poetic form into nasheed that clarifies the ideological battlefront. In the aftermath of the brutal Zionist aggression on Lebanon in 2006, which reduced the Beirut suburbs of Dahia to rubble, they released the iconic track, Lebanon is greater than this, Lubnan Akbar min Hayk. This nasheed was not a cry of despair. It was an affirmation that Lebanon's identity, faith, and resistance could not be flattened by bombs. Through rhythmic chants and Quranic references, they declared that Dahia may fall, but the soul of Wilaya will only rise. They're quoted as saying, we remain with you, O Nasrallah, until final victory is declared. Their voice, like their lyrics, became a living poem written across the ruins, reminding the ummah that resistance is not only armed, it is also sung. Please give me a salawat and we move on to witness when the truth walked and spoke.
اللهم صل على
صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So if ink preserves and the poem stirs, it is witness that risks. Witness stands where silence is easier. It talks where it walks where others flee. It speaks even when the world will punish it for doing so. The Quran honors this act. In Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, the chapter of the cow, second chapter of the Quran, verse 140, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and who is more unjust than one who conceals testimony he has from God? To conceal the truth is injustice. To declare it, even in the courts of tyrants, is wilaya. So let's look at some case studies over here. First of all, of course, you have said Zaynab, the voice of Karbala. Chained, unveiled, dragged from court to court, said Zaynab, peace and blessings be upon her, did not flinch. In Yazid's palace in Damascus, she stood not as a grieving sister, but as a proof of God. Her sermon clarified history for all eternity. So plot your schemes, exert your efforts, and stretch your hostility. By God, you shall never erase our remembrance. Her words were not just resistance, they were tabyeen, divine clarification in the language of fire. Next, we come to Imam Ali ibn Husayn Zayn al-Abidin, the witness in chains. He witnessed Karbala with his own eyes. His chains were the punctuation to every injustice. Yet he did not merely survive, he clarified in the court of Yazid. When asked who he was, he replied, I am the son of the one slain in patience, and that is honor enough. Later, his Sahifa Sajjadiyya and Risalat al-Huquq became charters for rights and whispered revolutions. One Sahifa Sajjadiyya especially became one that clarified worship, justice, and resistance through dua. Next, we have Ammar ibn Yasir, the first witness of the Ummah. A student of the Prophet, a soldier of Imam Ali, and a living embodiment of clarity under fire. Ammar's death at the hands of Muawiyah's army became a divine sign. The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him and his family, had said, and there's consensus in this hadith between the Sunni and the Shia, The Prophet had said, Ammar will be killed by the rebellious faction. His death was not just martyrdom, it was Tabyeen with blood. His silence spoke louder than banners. Next, we look at Imam Khomeini, the clarifier of the century. His sermons shook palaces. His pen revived religion, and his tears purified politics. Imam Khomeini did not merely oppose tyranny. He clarified what Islam truly means. He's quoted as having said, "We are duty-bound, not results-driven." His life was the synthesis of ink, poem, and witness. He stood, and the world shook. Next, let's look at Shahid Beheshti, the philosopher of Islamic justice. A jurist, a scholar, an architect of Iran's post-revolutionary judiciary, Ayatollah Dr. Sayyid Muhammad Hussein Beheshti, may God rest his pure soul, embodied ethical clarity. When accused and defamed, he replied not with vengeance, but with God consciousness. He said, "Let them all curse us. We will continue our work." His assassination in 1981, alongside 72 others, became a defining moment in the Jihad of clarification. Next, you have Ayatollah Sayyid Hussein Fadlallah, the marja who refused silence. A jurist, a thinker, and spiritual father to the oppressed in Lebanon and beyond, Ayatollah Fadlallah, may God rest his pure soul, stood at the crossroads of modernity and faith, clarifying Islam through pulpits, publications, and principled defiance. He rejected sectarianism, criticized both Eastern and Western hegemonies, and voiced solidarity with the oppressed, especially the people of Palestine, Iraq, and Yemen. He is quoted as having said, "A Muslim cannot be neutral towards the issues of his ummah. Silence is a betrayal of the oppressed." And again, all the references are in the write-up. His Friday sermons and media outreach became a model for spiritual leadership rooted in action. Until his death in 2010, he embodied witness through reason, mercy, and clarity. Next, we have Said Hassan Nasrallah, the voice they tried to silence. Until his martyrdom in September 2024, killed in a massive Israeli-backed bombing campaign that leveled parts of Dahia in Beirut, Said Hassan Nasrallah, may God rest his pure soul, was not merely a resistance leader. He was a global witness, a clarifier of truth from Gaza to Lebanon, from Syria to Yemen. He stood not with slogans, but with strategic truth, rooted in Quranic insight and the pain of the oppressed. It was his words that made tyrants tremble. And it was for these words that he was killed. An example, he said, "We are a people Imam Husayn is never defeated." But he did not cry only for the Levant. He wept for Yemen, where a Western-backed siege choked children in silence. He declared, "Everything happening in Yemen, the killing, the starvation, the displacement, is the responsibility of America and its followers." Said Hassan's voice was Husseini in content and Zaynabi in courage. His martyrdom was not a silencing. It was a global echo of Tabyeen that will not fade. So now let's have a look at the call to clarify. You are the link they died for. O servant of truth, you who write, speak, cry, or remain steadfast, you are not disconnected. You are the continuation. They clarified for their time. Now it is your time. Your silence will serve someone. Will it serve the oppressor or will it serve the oppressed? So write like Tyndale. Sing like Ahangaran. Stand like said Zaynab. Because clarity is not inherited, it is earned. And you, O mourner, O student, O witness, you are the ink, the poem, and the voice they hoped would survive. Please give me a salawat and we move on to censorship and the culture of forgetting.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
So in every age, the enemies of truth have not only feared the message, they have feared the memory. When the truth cannot be defeated, it is hidden. When the martyr cannot be defamed, he is forgotten. When the pen cannot be broken, it is drowned in noise. We now live in an age where censorship has evolved, no longer confined to blunt instruments such as burning books or banning speakers or assassinating witnesses. It now works through algorithms, filters, media framing, and emotional anesthesia. And what it cannot ban, it buries. We call this the culture of forgetting. It is more effective than brute force because it leaves no corpse, only silence. Let's look at the many faces of censorship. Censorship today is not only political, it is psychological, cultural, even spiritual. Firstly, you have algorithmic suppression. Resistance voices are labeled extremist, shadow banned, demonetized. Even martyrdom becomes a violation of community guidelines. Next, you have narrative control. When a Yemeni child starves, it is a regional conflict. When Palestinians resist, it's militancy. When Shia tears fall in Muharram, they're exoticized, politicized, or omitted entirely. Next, you have memory obstruction. Historic crimes like the siege of Karbala or the genocide in Gaza are relativized or reframed to dilute outrage. Internal censorship. Hearts become numb. Distractions multiply. Entertainment replaces reflection. Language itself is stripped of clarity. This is not just silencing, it is confusion. Imam Ali, peace and blessings be upon him, has said, "Whoever revives his heart sees the truth." If the heart dies, truth disappears, even if it is right in front of you. Let's now look at the Quranic command to remember. The Quran places dhikr or remembrance at the center of spiritual and historic survival. In Quran, Surah Ibrahim, the chapter of Prophet Ibrahim, 14th chapter of the Quran, verse number 5, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Remind them of the days of God." Those who forget the days of God, the moments when truth clashed with tyranny, become soft, vulnerable, and susceptible to manipulation. In the same way as Pharaoh rewrote the past to maintain his throne, the tyrants of today erase, distort, and distract to break the chain of remembrance. Ziyarat Ashura, Ziyarat Arbaeen, Dua Nudba, among others, and the mourning rituals of Shia Islam are not merely devotional, they are defiant memory in the face of organized forgetting. Let's now have a look at the battle for memory is the battle for meaning. To remember is to resist. That is why Imam Zayn al-Abidin wept for 20 years after Karbala, not as grief alone, but as resistance through remembrance. That is also why Said Zaynab said, "By God, you shall never erase our remembrance." In a world trying to turn truth into spectacle and sacrifice into trivia, our memory becomes a form of jihad. Imam Khamenei has warned, and this is paraphrased, and the references are all in the write-up. Any nation that forgets its history will be forced to repeat it. Let's now have a look at the call to clarify. Revive what they try to erase. O witness of Husayn, if they try to delete your voice, write it again. If they bury your memory, exhume it with clarity. If they silence the martyrs, let your life speak for them. Archive the forgotten. Speak what others fear to name. Turn your art, your prayers, your code, your silence into remembrance. Because to remember Hussein is to confront every Yazid. And to clarify truth is to become a living link in the chain of divine memory. Please give me a salawat and we move on to the conclusion.
اللهم صل على
اللهم صل على
محمد
محمد
وآل
محمد
محمد.
You are the ink, the poem, and the witness. So, you who have reached this point, you who have walked through ink spilt in prison, poems whispered in bunkers, and voices raised before tyrants, know this. You are not reading history. You are inheriting it. You are not recounting the past to mourn it. We are not recounting the past to mourn it. We are clarifying it so that you will never walk into confusion alone. Firstly, you are the ink. If the Quran descended today, it would be revealed again in the ink of the oppressed, the pen of the exile, and the scratch of the child denied school, and the blooded notebooks in a Gaza hospital. The Quran, Surah al-Qalam, 68th chapter of the Quran, verse number 1, chapter of the pen. Allah says, Noon, by the pen and what they write. That oath was not to ink alone. It was to those who write what must be written. And so the ink is now yours. You are the poem. If Husayn is the truth, then every verse that mourns him, or praises him, or defends him becomes a sword. Your voice may tremble, your words may rhyme, but if they clarify, they are poem. And if they clarify for God, they are witness. Let the rhythm of your sorrow become the cadence of your resistance. Let your lament, like Faiz, like Ahangaran, or the poets of Arbaeen, refuse to forget, because you too were born into a battlefield, and your silence will be read. Next, you are the witness. Said Zaynab stood before Yazid without an army, without a weapon, even without her veil. But she clarified. Imam Sajjad, frail and chained, still clarified. Imam Khomeini, exiled and surrounded, still clarified. Said Hassan, until his final breath, clarified. Shaykh Beheshti, Dr. Shariati, Atullah Fadlallah, Shaykh Mutahari, all of them clarified until it cost them everything. And you have their voice. You have their blood. You have their mission. Not because you are them, but because they planted you. Let's now look at our final call to clarify. Let them never say we were silent. O child of Karbala, O mourner of Gaza, O poet of Wilaya, O whisperer beneath the digital throne, they will try to erase you. They will rename your pain. They will pixelate your wounds and monetize your memory. Do not let them. Write what must be remembered. Weep what must not be forgotten. Stand where others are crushed. Speak even if no one hears, for God hears. Because the day will come when Said Zaynab's voice is heard again. And when it is, it will not be through minarets or missiles alone. It will be through your clarity. Tabyeen is not a project. It is a trust. And now, O soul of ink, poem, and witness, that trust is yours. Please give me a salawat, and we move to the supplication eulogy this evening, which is titled, Until the Sun Rises in the West.
اللهم صل
اللهم
على
صل على
محمد
محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
In your name, O you who never forgets a tear shed in secret, who preserved every whisper of Zaynab, every sigh of Sajjad, who heard the children cry in Karbala and hears them still in Rafah, in Sa'ada, in Fallujah, in Sana'a, in Quds. O light that does not flicker, O truth that does not age, we stand at the end of this chain, a chain of ink, of poem, of witness, and we do not wish to break it. O Husayn, you called out, is there anyone to help me? and your call still echoes, not in the desert, but in our devices, our voices, and our hearts. We were not there at Nainawa, but we are here now. And we say not as slogan, but as pledge. We are with you, O Husayn. A ready pledge of aid for you. Let the angels record this is not a recitation, but a recruitment. O Zaynab, we heard you in Kufa, in Sham, before the tyrant, in chains. You did not tremble, and so we must not flinch. You said, by God, you shall never erase our remembrance. So here we are, writing, reciting, crying, coding, creating, so that the remembrance of Husayn will never be drowned in distraction. You are the mother of Tabyeen, and we are the inheritors of your voice. O Mahdi, O the one in occultation, but not in absence. O Imam of the broken-hearted, O proof of God upon the earth. We have read the Ziyarah, we have walked Arbaeen, we have wept our hearts dry, but is it enough? Do our feet walk while our hands remain idle? Do our tongues curse Yazid, but remain silent before modern pharaohs? We call upon you not to hasten, but to count us among those who are hastening. We call upon your Lord, as you taught us in Dua Nudbah. Where is the one who shall avenge the blood of the one slain in Karbala? We are not waiting for you to rise. We are preparing the ground on which you will walk. O God, we do not ask to be poets. We do not ask to be preachers. We ask only this: make us among the believers who aid him and await his reappearance. Make us among the 313, the ones who will not excuse themselves with cowardice, caution, or comfort. And I will never, ever sit still. We do not ask for fame. We ask for footsteps in your army. We do not ask for safety. We ask for sincerity. We do not ask for escape. We ask for Quds, not just the land, but the sanctity of your justice in every land. O awaited one, we are not of the silent. We are not of the forgetful. We are not of the neutral. We are the remnants of Zaynab, the children of the chain, the readers of dua, and the screamers of truth. Let us be those who prepare your banner, build your battleground, defend your Quran, and weep for your loneliness until your name is no longer whispered but declared. So let the sun rise in the west. Let Mecca and Medina be liberated. Let Quds return to its rightful people. Let Gaza dance in your light. Let us pray behind you with Jesus, the Son of Mary, in the final congregation. And let the earth rejoice that truth was not erased, because the witness remains, and we are not of the silent, and we are preparing, not for your coming, but for our accountability when you arrive. Amen, O Lord, sustainer of the universes. Amen, O most merciful of the merciful. وآخر الدعوان الحمد لله رب العالمين والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.